So just how can we know that God exists? This is a question which can have no answer or every answer depending on your perspective. But today I'd like to look into one particular argument that has been around for quite a while that I think we would argue has aged very well. This is Eric Slawick, aka the UWM pen guy, from all UWM friends.
This is Alex Burks.
And this is our next episode of the series, Does God Exist? So, Alex, would you like to begin us off then with the Kalam Cosmological Arguments and its foundations?
Sure. So a couple of preliminary points I would make. A lot of people view God in this day and age as a sort of sentimental predisposition. You know, if you're born into a religious family, then you might kind of believe in God. But, you know, the ancient Greeks believed in Zeus, and we believe in Jesus. And, you know, it's all sort of relative. Whatever your truth is, we can never really know. This sort of cultural agnosticism, that sort of thing, right? And so the Christian would say, A, that there is objective reality, and we can know this via human reason, and B, God is not a sentimental predisposition. God is an absolute fact that exists in the universe, and that, like all absolute facts, can be reasoned to, studied, and progressed into, you know, if that makes sort of sense. So the first thing that I would say to get people, the wheels turning, is the question, why does something exist rather than nothing? This isn't a theistic proof, it's just a question. Why does something exist rather than nothing? If you look at modern science, it would seem that it's more likely that nothing would exist as opposed to something. So complexity wouldn't beget complexity, nothing would beget nothing. So that isn't absolutely true, but it's just sort of something to think. The absolute end of the day, something exists. Why? Is that something an accident or is it intentional? The sort of next question I would kind of throw out to people is, if the universe is complicated, or if the universe is has a beginning, and the universe is complicated, and the universe kind of begets further complexity, then it would kind of reason that the origin of the universe would have to be outside of time, since the universe, you know, possesses time. Time acts upon it. It possesses space. Therefore, whatever created it, if it does have a creator, would have to be outside of time and space, and it would have to be presumably very intelligent, maybe even omniscient, because the universe is obviously very complicated. So if you see a very complicated painting or a very complicated piece of machinery, you wouldn't automatically assume that it produced itself. So we're looking presumably at a being that is spaceless, timeless, very hyper intelligent, and I would say that the universe, or at least the moral impulse, tend towards the good. We know what is right and we know what is wrong. So perhaps we're talking about a being that is timeless, spaceless, terribly clever, and morally good, or has some sort of moral agency. So we're just throwing out the general framework for the Christian position, or the theistic position, the classical theistic position. So the first argument I would posit, now that we're kind of in that space, would be the Kalam Cosmological Argument. This is a very old argument, and it has some of its roots in kind of ancient Persian Muslim thought during the golden age of Islam and the golden age of Islamic intellectual thought. So, Eric, are you ready for the argument?
I am ready for the argument. Oh, I wanted to say, first of all, sorry, that so are we, just in the context of that general framework, are we, how would we maybe so far address the only alternative possibility that's taken seriously today outside of very, very slim circles of people, that the universe essentially exploded itself into existence? Or more technically speaking, when I heard Lawrence Krauss try to explain this, that, and not to get into the details of the science, but the argument seemed to boil down to nothing, something can come from nothing because it's actually a potential something. So is that something we can address on a purely logical basis with the universe we can all observe? Or or is that too detailed science?
No, I think that just because something can come from something, and because it is a potential something, doesn't make it likely or even feasible that it would. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If I have a potential, I mean, potentially, due to the way that photons and matter is constructed, I could toss my hand through my desk right now and have it pass clean through. According to theoretical physics, that's hypothetical. Is that accurate? Or is it possible? No, it's functionally, for all intents and purposes, impossible, right? It's possible that a plane or a bullet could come through the window and kill me right now. And that potential scenario could happen. Is that likely? It's like, not really. And so if you're looking at a matter of sheer mathematics, could the universe, with all of the attributes that we know it, come to being from nothing because it is potential something? I would say that no. I would say that it's probably impossible that the universe, with all its complexity, comes to being as we know it without an exterior intellect and mind to actualize it.
Because you were pointing out some of the qualities of the universe already that make it seem as if though that would basically, I would even argue, or I would go as far as saying that it's not just impossible. The idea behind the Big Bang is essentially meaningless, because what does it actually mean for a matterless void of nothingness to produce a universe? What is that concept? How do you even actualize that as a real thing?
And I would say that the 20th century is a history of very smart people realizing that the Big Bang, the expansion of the universe from a single point, is the argument, or it is the reality that we have the best evidence for, and then running from the conclusions of that. So I would say that the Big Bang, whatever you want to call that moment, is what we have the best evidence for as an origin marker for the universe. But that points to something along the lines of theism. Now, Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking go down the list of the great scientific minds. Maybe not Dawkins; he's not terribly clever most of the time. But they've come to the point where they have to start positing theories that don't make a whole lot of sense, like the multiverse, because a universe that has a beginning point points to theism, especially the universe as we know it, especially the Big Bang as we know it. It all kind of suggests that the universe has some sort of guiding mind, and all of the arguments that I kind of want to toss out, except the last one, have an origin, they are based on the point from the universe having a beginning. So if we believe that the universe had a beginning, then it's pretty solid ground that you can make a lot of these theistic arguments and they hold up better than if we have a different sort of universe, like a multiverse or an eternal universe.
This is a real geeky point, but and I don't want to make a philosophical argument from comic movies, but the way that Marvel, I think everyone agrees, has sort of butchered their last couple of phases, in part because they tried the multiverse thing, might be a silly but still vaguely pertinent example of the absurdities that come with a multiverse.
Yeah.
Just as all stakes are removed when you accelerate the drama to infinite possibilities, I would argue all logic is eliminated when you can have infinite permutations of 5 events in your life.
Well, you find oftentimes that modern science is theoretical physicists running away from the conclusions of their research, and people get very invested in certain conclusions. That is infinitely valuable. But the issue we make, I think, on the theistic side of things is viewing modern science and the scientists that practice it as infallible. And we forget that they have certain conclusions, certain presuppositions, and certain things that they would like to be true and certain things that they would not like to be true. And so just as the scientists supposedly of the Middle Ages, who started engineering the university system and the very beginnings of modern sciences, we view those as stooges of the church. The modern sciences are just as biased, but in very different ways.
And Answers in Genesis, actually, that the Ken Ham related organization I mentioned in the first episode, actually talks about the rise of science quite a bit. And you look at the history, and Catholic or Protestant, it's remarkable how opposite the story of science is from the one that you get in a lot of the, I guess you could just say, anti-Christian narrative, that the church facilitated science, that all leading modern scientists until maybe the 18th century did their science specifically because they believed there was a God who created an orderly universe, and therefore rational beings can discover the laws that governed that order.
I mean, precisely. And I think G.K. Chesterton talks about this in his book on St. Francis of Assisi. If the universe is something, or if the created order is something to be worshipped, there, as it was in the pagan kind of mythos, where it's like every rock and every tree and every river and every mountain is a deity, then the natural world is something to be worshipped. It's not something to be studied. But the Christian conception revolutionizes that, where it says that man is the pinnacle of creation, but we are stewards of everything else. And all of us, everything that we see is a creature of God. And so it kind of changes the dynamic when we look at and think about doing science.
And I think we would both agree that there was kind of a nexus or coalescing of events in the late Middle Ages that came together around the pivot point, the fall of Constantinople, which caused all those Byzantine manuscripts to reawaken classical thinking in Western Europe.
Sure.
The consolidation of nation states. I'm trying to think if I bring this one up or not. Nah, that's too partisan. I have a miniature version of this that I'll bring up by the end of the program, which I think we can actually agree on. The rise of the Renaissance I think we would agree broadly that the spirit of the Renaissance did make Western Europe more open to inquiry that may have been either not possible or kind of frowned upon at an earlier date. And to be fair to the Catholic Church, my understanding is that the church did patronize a lot of this art and architecture, and in Italy was a friend of development.
And I think that's objectively true, because I think that the Christian conception, and when it's properly thought through, is that truth is truth, and God is the author of all truth. And that's something that's all throughout the epistles of St. Paul and all the writings in the New Testament, is God is truth, and Christ is the Word of God. He's the divine intelligibility. Therefore, if you study the natural world and you come to a certain truth, and you study the scriptures and you come to another truth, those truths can't be in conflict, because if they are indeed true, their origin is from God. And so in God's universe, two truths can't conflict. I think the thing we see in the modern world is a farce of religion and a farce of science that we pit, one against the other. But really, if you are thinking about this honestly, there is no conflict between science and religion, because if science is true and religion is true, how can there be a conflict?
And I think that, actually, this is a perfect connection. The infamous trial of Galileo, I think, is a perfect example of this, because I remember watching a mid 2000s ish, 2010s cable program about Galileo, which the line was, and this was the battle between science and religion faith and reason.
Yep.
When AIG and Answers, Genesis, and Reality, they lay out kind of the reality of the picture. It was sort of a spectacle all around. Galileo historically was not a nice man. He went out of his way to antagonize the church.
Sure.
But on the other hand, the church didn't fail so much because it believed in the Bible or the Christian faith. It failed because it had kind of fossilized that heliocentric, everything goes around the sun cosmology and elevated it to the level of near dogma. And the church did eventually adapt. But as the Catholic on the program here, that's my understanding of it, was that it was an error in judgment. What would be kind of your feelings or thoughts about that whole issue?
I've heard it said that the church rejected Galileo not because they thought he was speaking heresy, but because he couldn't substantiate his thesis with evidence. And so that was the greater issue with the church is, the church is hesitant to promulgate a lot of things, and especially if you don't have, the receipts, so to speak, to prove it, they're not going to promulgate a certain doctrine or concept or even deem it to be something morally viable because they don't know. So that was my understanding, is that he had this idea that was right, but his, limited technology and limited knowledge, and we can't fault him for that, was insufficient to convince the representatives of the church that he was dialoguing with. Also, in the High Middle Ages, you almost perpetually had petulant popes and dissidents in this kind of high drama that was the courts of these bishop princes of the church. Now, that's nothing to say of the theology of it, but the brute fact is, like you said, Galileo wasn't a very good man, and you had a lot of very proud men serving in the chair of St. Peter at the time, and it didn't necessarily lead to the greatest mix of egos or the type of environment that we would hope that would allow Christian civility to prevail.
Would you still say, because I'm using this as sort of a case study of what you're talking about compared to the modern age, would you still say that holding to heliocentrism, I mean, obviously it was a mistake. So what was your understanding of the reason? I mean, so they saw it as a credibility issue, essentially, that heliocentrism had seemed to hold up through the centuries, and going with this new radical idea, they were actually concerned they would damage the church's credibility. Is that kind of the idea?
From my understanding, I do plead ignorance generally on the Galileo incident in details, but I would say it was more Galileo couldn't prove his thesis, and this was more of a personality squabble between the Pope and himself.
Okay, and that's kind of my understanding of it too. And so it's basically mythology, or as AIG put it, it's kind of hagiography for atheists. I was just going to say, I think that people like simple narratives, and I'm not a scientist, but I can tell you science is not simple. And I do know a bit of theology, and theology, despite what people think, is not simple. None of these questions are simple. Not even, history isn't even simple. What we know about certain individuals and all that kind of stuff. What I will say is the Catholic Church is probably one of the least anti-science organizations in the world, because throughout history, you see kind of the basis of modern science being in the church. The issue was, as time went on, people wanted to do things a little bit more free form. And I would say the nucleus of modern science, modern Western science, is in the church, but it quickly moved beyond the church and to disastrous effect. Yeah, and I mean, not to make this necessarily a program about history, but in order to understand how we arrived at this schizophrenic moment in time today, you had obviously the quote unquote Enlightenment and the philosophers, and you had that whole era, which, by the way, was the primary influence for the founding fathers of America. It wasn't Christianity, in case anyone was wondering. But then, obviously, less than 2 decades later, you had the calamity of the French Revolution, which was perhaps, you could say, a more logical outcome of pure, unguided natural reason run amok.
Well, and one quick thing about that, Eric, I think is really interesting is the fact that one episode in the French Revolution exemplifies this, because you had the symmetric beauty of a place like Notre Dame de Paris, and if you think that medievals were ignorant, think about what it takes to build a cathedral, especially a cathedral. Building these churches was a masterwork in mathematics and logistics and theological meditation. And you had the French Revolutions come in, and they cut all the heads off the statues outside because they thought they were kings of France. They were actually kings of the nation of Israel. And these idiots, they ransacked the place and they built a temple to pure reason. Now, I look at that just as an example, and I would see a lot of uneducated, ignorant kind of ideologues going to a place that was raised in the name of reason and desecrating it, right? And so that's an interesting little parallel where we're kind of propagandized. And like you said, all the other instances of the French Revolution is pure reason, and they were guillotining 30 people a day and worshiping pure reason. And I think that's kind of a step back into the heathenism and the paganism of the Romans, as opposed to a step forward into enlightenment.
And I would even add that you had the kind of frenzy that you see later in the 20th century, once communism came on the scene, with the mentality of because Robespierre himself was ultimately done in by the revolution he helped to nursemaid, because at some point he wasn't even extreme enough for the faction that was in power. And how you had a process, to keep this on track with our subject, that began with genuine positive developments away from sort of a stodgy, hyper dogmatic, superstitious broad medieval culture. I'm certainly not. I'm going to agree entirely that there was a lot of sophistication in the Middle Ages, but it was kind of mostly locked up in the monasteries, broadly speaking. And you bring things like science, proto-medicine, technology, the spread of culture and literacy and such, and it goes so completely off the rails. Napoleon Bonaparte obviously he forced a stop to the chaos by means of turning Europe into a long-term ticking time bomb that would implode in World War I. But in the meantime, the legacy of the revolution kind of overturned a lot of tradition. And then after the 20th century, genocides, world wars, ideologies, Europe today is obviously sort of I'm left leaning in my politics, but I've seen stats that Europe is like 98% secular now in a lot of the major West European countries.
And to great sorrow. And you look at something like, I don't know if you've been following the Olympics at all, but the opening ceremony to the Olympics, and it's kind of this gross hedonism. And the country that was once called the eldest daughter of the church has just now discarded her legacy. And I would say, again, we see that common theme of supposedly progress, but the way that these things are actually manifesting, it looks a lot more like regression into a pagan past, as opposed to moving forward into some sort of enlightened state and world being. And this makes me sad, because you look at the new atheists, and they thought that the more we set ourselves away from theology, religion, and Judeo-Christianity, then the more we'll be liberated. But from what I'm seeing, the more we move away from Christianity, the more we embrace tribalism, hedonism, foolish superstition. You'll have people on college campuses who will look at you crazy for being a Christian, then proceed to go check their horoscopes and purchase crystals. People don't necessarily think rationally. And when we kind of throw off the church, and whatever you take that to mean, as the mother of reason and the mother of all things that are true, we sort of more and more deeply embrace this retrogressive pagan insanity.
I remember watching one of Trent Horn, the Catholic apologist programs. I try to sample widely, or at least not exclusively in my own tradition. He was playing an atheist who was lamenting the rise of wokeism because, and if our audience isn't aware of what we mean by that, we basically mean the radical left ideology that typically settles on like identity, racial, cultural, sexual, whatever, as the primary means by which a human being defines themselves. And it's a revolutionary mindset. And like we were saying about the French Revolution, it will purge, and it will purge from the inside and throughout any part of culture it's allowed to infect, really. To be clear, I'm a liberal myself, but kind of an old school liberal. But I've seen the effects of this. And this atheist, Trent Horn's point was, this is exactly what you're saying. He was it might have been Richard Dawkins. I think it might have been Richard Dawkins. And because he was lamenting, like, we thought if we just got rid of religion, all that silly superstition, then it'd be reason would prevail. We'd have a golden age. And instead, as you were suggesting, they didn't change human nature. Human beings are fundamentally religious. Human beings need tribal identity. They need a cause. They need something higher than themselves to devote their lives to, or they will kind of wither and die internally. And so, as you were suggesting, especially in America, what happened was people stopped seeing that in their traditional religious affiliation, and they started seeing that in politics.
Sure.
And that's how we end up. We're going to be pretty nonpartisan on this program, but I think everyone would agree our political culture is broken. And I think we would also agree you and I would agree that's basically how we got here.
I mean, absolutely. And that's how these questions of the existence of God fundamentally play into our day-to-day lives. And I think it's not an abstract question whether or not God exists. It has a concrete effect, because if God exists, there is an objective moral arbiter by which we can base our actions, and by which we can know that other actions are evil. So it really does make the difference. And, me and Eric were talking earlier about the effects on smart people who don't believe God exists. It leads them to all measure of insanity, but it's logically consistent. I would just say it leads to evil. So you can kind of, as Christ says, know them by their fruits, where it's like, if you have a worldview that is intellectually thorough, but it leads to evil actions and evil outcomes, then, well, what are we really talking about here? And if Christianity is the great evil of history and the great myth and the great repression, the great repressor of man, then why does it generally lead to human flourishing? It's a fair question.
Yeah, and I would broadly agree, and I would even argue within the Christian framework that there is a parable Jesus tells that about a tree, and that is the kingdom of God, and it grows to expand and to encompass essentially the entire field. And it's supposed to be a picture, I think, of the fact that the spread of the gospel will change cultures. And broadly speaking, I am by no means a fan of cultural religion. I am by no means a fan of political Christianity. I'm quite the opposite. But broadly speaking, you look at the world before the rise of Christianity and after the rise of Christianity, and there is a fundamental difference. Greco-Roman politics, the kind Jesus was encountering, his context and the apostles, My favorite Roman historian, Adrian Goldsworthy, makes the point over and over again. Their politics were just purely personal. It was Augustus's faction versus Antony's faction, or Octavian versus Antony's faction. It was Caesar versus Pompey. And there was no ideology. Neither one of them. I mean, they'd have broad groupings of like populari and plebii or whatever, patricians and plebs and all that. But it was usually pretty broad, pretty vague, pretty manipulative. All that really mattered, their civil wars were all about who was going to sit on the throne. And they fought a lot of them. And today, the very fact that we are still arguing, although this may be changing, but for a long time at least, we've argued about ideology. Even the most extreme examples like communism and fascism in the 20th century and beyond are still essentially what I would call kingdom narratives. They are utopian. They are, which means they are essentially Christian derived or Christian adjacent. Even Nazism, the most, despicable and vile of all the ideologies in history, perhaps, what did they call it? The 1,000-year kingdom. They looked to a day when there would be flowing fields of grain for the betterment of, now it went off the rails when they said the race, their race, and not all mankind. So, but you have all this imagery, all this symbolism without which you wouldn't have had modern history, even in its darkest aspects. So I think the world today is unimaginable without answering the question, does God exist?
I agree too. And I think the thing that the Christian religion does is it moves the paradigm from self-filling into self-giving. No, very clearly, if you read Christian history, this idea was not always lived up to. But we can look at these instances when it was not lived up to and say there was a failing. But when you look at ancient Greco-Roman history, the kind of direct predecessor of Christianity, there is no, it's chaos. It's topsy-turvy. The moral right is with him who was the mightiest. And I just think of Alexander on his deathbed. This young man who had conquered half the world, who was dying. And I think the term in Greek is Christistos, and it was to the strongest. And he kind of, he took his signet ring and he was like, whichever one of you can take this. And it led to, decades of warfare. But that was his right because he was the mighty one. And it was the right of his generals to scramble after the spoils of his conquest, right? So, but the Christian would say, look at Christ, who's about the same age as Alexander the Great, ironically enough, on the cross, giving his life for others, right? And a life dedicated to public service. And he told his disciples, from everything we know about, the authentic historical Jesus, who I would say is the Jesus of Scripture, that the least is the greatest and the greatest is the least. And what you do to the least of your brethren, you do to the Lord. And so it is a revolution in, like you were saying, Eric, in cultural terms, but also in interpersonal terms. But Jesus' words hold no weight, and they are just the kind of ramblings of another moral guru, if he was not who he claimed to be. And who he claimed to be was God.
And I believe that this is probably a good place to wrap up this particular segment. On the cross, they nailed a sign in 3 languages, the languages of civilization as far as they knew it. Obviously, there were the Native Americans and the Chinese and such, but they didn't know about them. So it was, for all, they really did. Anyways, that's a whole other issue. But functionally, Rome thought of the world as Rome.
Sure.
And so it was intended to be this statement, the King of the Jews. It was divine irony, but it was essentially mockery. And it was this idea, when the Pharisees went to Pilate and they said, take that down, like put up a sign that says this man claimed to be the King of the Jews. And Pilate said, what I've written, I've written. Like, he hated the Pharisees. They had put him in the place of murdering a man he knew to be innocent or to possibly lose his head. under pressure from Caesar. And he was making a defiant statement for all time, but it ended up being God's defiant statement. Because like you were talking about, the upside down irony of the king of the universe hanging on history, possibly history's most brutal instrument of torture, in a way that God himself said was a sign that you were cursed and dying for the sins of fallen humans, is so much the opposite, like you said, of the value system of any let's call it independent human reason based morality, which like you said will ultimately default to just over time to just pure power. That it's at the end of the day, we don't quite see it yet in America. I don't think. We might disagree on that, but we may see the first inklings of it with wokeism, with the radical left, the radical right, with all of these people that live and die for politics, and with the general idea that we're kind of losing a sense of identity as a people. Because if you don't have that, if you don't have an anchor for your soul and an anchor for your worldview, eventually you are just going to drift. And you can do the closing comment, and then we'll say until shortly with the next episode.
I was just saying, I think it's entertaining that we prepped for the arguments, but I would say this is kind of a good primer for the arguments. As a student of theology, it can seem a little pie in the sky, but the beautiful thing about theology is it's terrifyingly pertinent to each and every one of our lives. And unlike something as kind of vague as astrophysics, theology, it plays an integral role in the lives and destinies of us all. And so kind of the idea is that if God is real, life has infinite meaning, and if he's not, it doesn't really have any meaning at all, objectively at least. So that's a good primer to say, what is the ground for why this matters, and where are we going in terms of the existence of God?
Yeah. So until next time, this is Eric the Pen Guy.
This is Alex the Papist.
And this has been part 2 of Does God Exist?
Cheers.